Today's reading comes from Mark's Gospel, and it's Mark chapter 2, verses 23, and then into chapter 3 up to verse 6. This is the early part of Mark's Gospel, and what's preceded this is Mark's introduction to who Jesus is. Jesus appeared. We're told about John the Baptist. We're told about the baptism of Jesus. And the proclamation from God, who says, "You are my own dear son, I am pleased with you." So we quickly establish who Jesus is. Jesus calls 4 fishermen, and then there follow a series of healing miracles. A man with an evil spirit healing many people, heals a man with a dreaded skin disease, heals a paralyzed man, and then he eats with people who the religious leaders find objectionable, the tax collectors and money lenders. So we begin after the original and initial acclamation of Jesus and delight in Jesus. Then we start to see the beginning of the opposition to Jesus by the religious authorities, and Mark gives us a number of situations in which Jesus is accused of doing things which are at variance with how people felt, or how the religious leaders felt people needed to behave. So this is chapter 2, verse 23. Jesus was walking through some cornfields on the Sabbath. As his disciples walked along with him, they began to pick the ears of corn. So the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, it is against our law for your disciples to do that on the Sabbath." Jesus answered, "Have you never read what David did that time when he needed something to eat? He and his men were hungry, so he went into the house of God and ate the bread offered to God. This happened when Abiathar was the high priest. According to our law, only the priests may eat this bread, but David ate it and he gave it to his men." And Jesus concluded, "The Sabbath was made for the good of man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Then Jesus went back to the synagogue, where there was a man who had a paralyzed hand. Some people were there who wanted to accuse Jesus of doing wrong, so they watched him closely to see whether he would heal the man on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man, "Come up here to the front." Then he asked the people, "What does our law allow us to do on the Sabbath? To help or to harm? To save a man's life or destroy it?" But they did not say a thing. Jesus was angry as he looked round at them, but at the same time he felt sorry for them, because they were so stubborn and wrong. Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it became well again. So the Pharisees left the synagogue and met at once with some members of Herod's party, and they made plans to kill Jesus. So it's a number, as I say, of episodes in Mark's Gospel of challenges to the religious authorities and their response. Now, the immediate verse before the reading we've just had is the one when Jesus talks to the religious leaders and says, "No one pours new wine into used wineskins, because the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the skins will be ruined. Instead, new wine must be poured into fresh wineskins." And with this delightful illustration, which meant a lot to people of the time, we get the sense that here is the good news of God, new and relevant, personal and intimate, a direct relationship between God and God's loved children, all of us, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, and didn't involve the religious authorities or the customs that they had created. So one by one, those are being challenged. And it's easy for each one of us to understand the injury that would do to our pride, our status, our sense of purpose, everything we were brought up to believe. So it's easy to see how it could be a challenge, but obviously what we do with that challenge is then completely different. To end with that final verse, that we just read in verse 6 that says, "So the Pharisees left the synagogue and met at once with some members of Herod's party, and they made plans to kill Jesus," is a little extraordinary, isn't it? We hear in John's Gospel how it's after the raising of Lazarus that the religious authorities, in deep frustration, suddenly come to the conclusion they have to get him killed because, frankly, he's getting too popular. There's just no stopping him. And when you bring people back from the dead, that's a miracle that's going to go with you, and people will understand what that means. That you are not just a man, as Nicodemus said in last week's reading, I think. You are a man sent by God, because that title was owned by many people. So this new wine in old wineskins just won't work. So coming to the religious authorities, in stark contrast to the people, it's impossible almost for them to understand that this is good news, that this is God's kingdom breaking into the world. To them it seems simply a challenge and a rebuttal and a kind of an affront to their entire lives. The question about the Sabbath picking ears of corn is very much a rabbinic kind of discussion, isn't it? I mean, Jesus kind of pushes back and simply says, look, David did it, so, it can't be an absolute rule or idea here. And in the healing of the man with the paralysed hand, that discussion about whether it's right to heal and the degrees of healing that one was allowed to do on the Sabbath, because it was written that you could save a person's life, but you couldn't just heal them for, minor ailments, because that was deemed as work, and the gathering of corn in the previous one was thought of as reaping, which is one of those things that's outlawed on the Sabbath, which means obviously setting off into a field and gathering in your crop. Well, that's very different from picking a few ears of corn to eat, isn't it? But the man with the paralysed hand, it's almost like, as I say, a debate when they have that. What does our Sabbath allow us to do? People would have had that debate. The more liberal Jewish leaders would have probably agreed with Jesus. And the man wasn't in danger of death. So we're not really talking about that challenge, about healing on the Sabbath. It's more about that interaction that he has when he looked around and said to them, and was angry and looked around at them, but felt sorry because, as it says, they were so stubborn and wrong. And that's the challenge that met with Jesus. It's the challenge that meets each of us if we talk about the good news of God, because it may fall on ears that are quite hostile, just simply incomprehending what we're saying. And this is the difficulty that often people face. But the man is healed, not to challenge them necessarily, because that's the answer to the question. When God, who is love, and in the case of Jesus, in human form with others, what is going to happen? Well, surely, it doesn't matter what time of day it is, it doesn't matter what day of the week it is. If somebody needs help, if somebody needs care and love, then they should be given it, irrespective of anything else, because the demands to love God with all our heart, soul, mind and spirit, and love our neighbour as ourselves, it trumps everything. It is more important than anything else. And if we find that our culture, our custom, even our religious practice gets in the way of simple one-to-one compassion, then something's gone wrong. Because all of our activity, especially our religious activity, which aims at its core to praise the God we adore, recognizing what God has done for us, if that gets in the way of helping a fellow human being, then something has gone very wrong indeed. And that's why Jesus was both angry and sad. It's such a shame, it's so frustrating that people are not able to see beyond their own context. And when I say people, I mean you and me. We're all totally and utterly guilty of this. How can we not? Because we're quite small beings in a large pool, a large sea of individuals, of different cultures and languages and traditions. How can it be that we are not somehow tribal animals as we are, looking at the world through our particular lenses? culture and context is one thing, prejudice and malice and hate are another. And whatever culture or context we can have, we can still have at our core the fact that people matter. And that can be, for many people, an ethical decision, a moral decision. But for those of us who call ourselves Christian, it's a simple truth, because we know that the God who made all things loves all people. And it's not just about us as individuals. There's everyone else in the world who matters too. We understand ourselves to be brothers and sisters with everybody else in the world, because we're all sons and daughters. That's where we come from. And guided by the unconditional love and grace that God showed in Jesus, we understand that that's our calling too, to reach out and show in action that we care and love for others, irrespective of the time, the place, or the expectations of other people.